Hi everyone and welcome to episode 20 of ARM Template Masterclass. This week we're going to be having a look at pipelines. So how can we use CI/CD type tools to automate and add value to our ARM templates? Now in the examples in here I'm going to be using Azure DevOps, but what we're talking about here could be applied to any other CI platform like Jenkins, Circle CI and so on. So feel free to adapt those to whatever you want. Now, the examples today are probably a little bit more complex than what we've looked at before. There's quite a few moving parts we're going to have a look at. So what I've done is all of the example code, all of the templates, the pipelines and so on are in a Git repo that's available for you to use, and you can check that out and you'll be able to either just build the example project that I use in the demo straight away, or you can use that to adapt and to build your own project. So you'll find this on the GitHub page. I'll put a link in the video notes, but you can see it here on screen. We've got this sample pipeline ready to go. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at two different types of pipelines that might be of use for you working with ARM templates. And these are a build pipeline and a release pipeline. And they're going to do two different things. So when we look at build, what we're talking about here is preparing your ARM templates for use by a wider audience. So we talked about before how you can build reusable ARM templates using some of the modular capabilities, or you can just have complicated templates that involve lots of nesting and need to reach out and call other templates which are stored in blob storage, for example. So the build pipeline is really where we're looking to prepare those templates for that sort of use. So the sort of scenario is you're working on a template, you've created all the resources and so on you need in your template, you check this into your Git repo for ready for use either by other people or by you when you actually run multiple templates, and it needs to go through this build pipeline before it's available for use. And this build pipeline is used for two things. Firstly, to run a lot of testing to make sure that our template passes all the tests that we've talked about in previous videos, and then to be able to deliver those templates to where they need to be. So if you're using nested templates, then you need to store them somewhere, as we mentioned before, that's accessible to the ARM platform. So not just the people reading the templates, but actually to Azure when it deploys them. So something like a storage account is the most common one, or a Git repo or something like that. And so that's what our build pipeline is going to do. And then our release pipeline picks up after our build. It takes those templates and it's actually going to deploy the templates to create the resources we need. And we're going to have a look at how we can use CI/CD to do that and to actually have multiple different environments. So we can have a dev and a production environment and control the deployments of those resources using a pipeline. Okay, so let's dive in and we'll start looking at the build platform. So we're using Azure DevOps and we're using the pipelines tooling here. As I mentioned, you could do this in any CI/CD tool you want, but obviously I'm just most familiar with Azure DevOps, so that's what we're going to use. And you can see we've got two pipelines. We've got our build pipeline and we've got our release pipeline. So we'll start off with the build. Okay, so this is our build pipeline. Now I've built this using the older visual pipeline editor you get in Azure DevOps, mainly so that it's easier for me to demo and show you on the actual video. There is a YAML version available of this in the actual GitHub repo, so if you want to use the newer YAML pipelines, you absolutely can do. This is just here mainly for demo purposes. And as you can see, we're going to run through a number of steps with our templates. So first up, we've set up the pipeline to actually use the GitHub repo, the same one we're using for this demo, in terms of templates. And so what we could have that do is anytime somebody checks into that repository, we could have this pipeline run, or maybe we only run it on pull requests, or somebody merges to master, whatever your workflow is to start the publishing of your templates. And we've got a single phase, we're just doing it in one phase, and we're running this on a build agent. Now I'm running this on a hosted build agent, so the build agent that Microsoft provide. If you wanted to, you can run it on an on-premises build agent as well. I'm using the Windows 2019 image. At the moment, this pipeline will only work on a Windows agent, primarily because of this first step, which I'll talk about in a second. If you wanted to run it on a Linux build agent, you probably could, but you'd have to adapt some of this. If we have a look at our pipeline, what we're doing is we're running these steps, and we're starting off with some tests. So the assumption is you've checked in your template, you want to run all your tests against it to make sure it's valid, and if it's not, you'll reject it at that point. We want to fail as early as possible. And we're incorporating all the tests we talked about in the previous videos. So the first thing is we're running the ARM template test toolkit tests against it. So if you remember, this was the first testing video, and this will test our template against some best practices. Now we're using a plugin here that I've developed just a bit of plugging of that. So this is the ARM TTK test plugin, and this allows you basically just to point it at your templates and it will run the TTK tests for you against that. So you can use that plugin. Obviously you could write that yourself in PowerShell if you wanted to as well, but this plugin's available, and it will basically let you point at where your templates are, so you can point it to that folder. You can give it a location to put the results, so it'll output the XML file. You can also include or skip tests if you want to, and that will run those tests for you. So very little configuration. I say that is a plugin that I wrote, but it is fairly useful. So that'll run the built-in TTK tests. Next, we want to run some of our own tests. So this is the second video on testing we looked at, where we ran some tests on our templates before we deployed them. And so this is using Pester, again, to run those tests. Now you'll notice I'm using an Azure PowerShell task here. There are some Pester tasks for Azure DevOps that you can use. There's a couple of them. And they will hook up Pester and start your tests for you. I'm not using those because the Pester extensions for Azure DevOps don't have an easy way to log into Azure PowerShell. So most of them were built in the assumption you were just running PowerShell tests. There was nothing to do with Azure with them. And so they don't have an option to log into Azure PowerShell to actually be able to run the AZ commandlets, which we need. Now, there are potentially ways around that, fiddling with the actual how you run them or running steps beforehand. But given that our Pester requirements are fairly straightforward and simple, it was easier just to run an Azure PowerShell commandlet and run it manually from PowerShell. So if we have a look at the actual script, we're just doing a very simple inline script which runs the invoke Pester command, passing it the path to our tests, the name of the output file and the output format, and that will run that, and that will do what we did on desktop, and will spit out an XML file with the NUnit test results in, which we can use later. So that will run our pre-deployment tests. Then we actually want to run our post-deployment tests. So these are the ones in episode 3 of testing where we looked at, okay, have we actually deployed what we think we've deployed? And for those, we obviously need some infrastructure to test. So the next step here is to run the ARM template to actually deploy the resources. Now, the ARM template we're using in this demo is very simple. It just deploys a storage account. But the steps are the same regardless. We've got this Azure Resource Group deployment task that we're going to use, telling it to create and update a resource group, giving it the name of the resource group and the location, and then we're pointing it at the actual template. And you see you can actually use either a linked artifact, which is what we're doing, so the actual template file's in the Git repo, but you can also point it to a URL if you want, and it will download that. So we're just pointing it at the template file that's in our Git repository, and we're also pointing it at a parameters file that holds the parameters for that test. And that's it. Everything else is pretty much left to default, and that will go and deploy those resources for us. Once that's deployed, we can move on to this test, which will then go ahead and actually test those resources. And again, we're using Azure PowerShell, so we can log in and we can then run Pester. But the Pester command here you can see is a little bit more complicated. Because we want to pass in some configuration data to Pester, we're having to use some of the more advanced features of Pester, and in particular Pester 5.1. Previous versions of Pester were actually slightly easier to do this sort of thing with, but they made it a bit more complex, but for various reasons. And so what we are doing is we're creating a configuration object for Pester, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, so the Pester docs cover this quite well. But what we're doing is we're creating this Pester configuration object. We're setting it to the true for the fact that we want test results enabled, and where we want the test results actually output to. Then we're creating a container, and the container contains the actual test file we want to run, but more importantly, it contains any parameters we want to pass in. So we parameterize this test to take a resource group, so you can run it against multiple resource groups. And so we're passing in the name of the resource group want to use. We then add that container to the configuration. We turn on pass-through on the configuration so that we can get the result of the test. And then we're running invoke Pester to run that with that configuration file, and we're passing the result here. Because we want this to fail, if the actual template, if the tests fail, then we need to get the result, and we're going to exit this PowerShell with the failed count. So if there's no failed tests, then it will get 0. It will pass, and if there are failed results, then it will fail, and it will fail the task in Azure DevOps. So those are all the tests we've run. Now what we want to do is we want to publish those test results. So we want to make those test results visible in Azure DevOps so we can see them when we run our pipeline. And so there is this publish test task that's part of the built-in task list. And all we're going to do is tell it the format, which is NUnit we're using for us, and point it at where to find the test results files. So all those XML files that we've created from the previous tests and which folder to run them in. And it will go and pick those up. Now there is one additional thing we do here. If we go into the control options, we do here is we have this run this task even if previous task has failed unless the build was cancelled. We want this to run every time, even if some of our tests have failed and they show up as failed tasks in here. We want this to run because we want it to collect our failed results and show them. If we had the default of waiting, assuming that the previous task had run, then obviously it would never reach here if some of these had failed tests in them. And so we make sure we set that up. And similarly on the next step, we want to clean up any of the actual Azure resources that we created for this test. We don't want them hanging around. So we use the resource group deployment task again to delete the resource group, so the same resource group from before. And again, we're running that even if a previous task has failed, because we don't want these test infrastructure tasks to fail and then this not run so it doesn't clean up the resources. We always want those resources cleaned up. So we reach the end of here. All of our tests have run. Hopefully they've all passed. If they haven't passed, then we'll stop at that point because there's a failure here. If they have passed, then we'll move on to the next section. And this is all about publishing those files. So now that they've passed and we're sure these are valid files we want to use, we want to upload these to our location where we're going to pull them from. And so what I'm doing here is I am just taking a copy of the files and putting them in their own folder so they're on their own. And then what I'm doing is zipping those up using the zip task and then copying them up to a blob storage. Now, if you were going to actually use these files directly from the blob storage, then potentially you don't want the zip step. You would drop that off and you would actually copy the files straight into blob storage so they could be read like that. But if you're looking to put them up there so somebody can manually download them or so on, then you can use the archive task to do that. It's just an example of the sort of usage you can use when you're uploading those files. So now we've got a pipeline here. When it's run, it looks a bit like this. So let's go into the build. We'll go have a look at the run one. You can see I've got plenty of failed ones from when I was testing this, but we'll go have a look at one that's run. And you can see that it's run our tasks through. If we have a look through them, all of our tasks are green. And you can come in here and you can have a look at your results, and you can see these tests passed, 6 failed, 6 passed, sorry, and not failed, and so on. But also, if we go back to the front page, we've got this tests tab. And if we click on here, we get a nice visual representation of the tests. And we can actually come in here and say, okay, we'll look at the past tests, and it will show us all those tests, and we can have a look at them and see what's happened and which tests have run and so on. Okay, so that's our build pipeline. This allows us to take our templates, somebody's editing them, run them through this process, test them, make sure they're okay, and then publish them up to blob storage or wherever we want. You could also put them into GitHub or so on, ready for somebody to consume to deploy actual resources. So none of this pipeline is deploying any resources that would be used in for actual environments. Yes, we deploy some test resources, but we delete them after we're done. So it's all temporary. So the next pipeline we'll look at is the release pipeline. And this one I have done in YAML because there's quite a big difference between the old release and the new releases. So this is doing a couple of things. So the first thing is we're actually deploying our resources. So we're using the same Azure Resource Group deployment task to do the deployment. And we're actually running the same template. You can see here we've got the Azure deploy template again that we're running. And we're passing in a parameters file, but we've got a parameters file for the dev environment. And what we're actually doing is we're deploying to 2 environments. So this first one is to dev, and then secondly, we've got a production deployment. So this sort of simulates that we want to deploy to our dev environment, we want to run some manual tests, or we want to allow our developers to use that, and then we're going to go and move to production when we're ready. And so this is using the multi-stage pipeline setup that you have with Azure DevOps. So you can deploy what they call these stages, and the stages define, say, the different environments, so the development environment and the production environment we want to deploy to, and then within that we have various jobs and steps, and the only step we're doing here is actually run the deployment, so it's fairly simple. You can obviously make these deployments a lot more complicated. You can add tests in if you wanted to. You can deploy other things. You could install your applications after you've done your deployments and so on. You can make them very complicated, but all we're doing is we're running the Azure Resource Group deployment task. Same for both, but with a different set of parameters. So this is using the dev.azure-deploy.parameters.json, and the production one is using the prod.azure-deploy.parameters.json. You'll also notice that the production section is a bit bigger than the other one because we're adding in an environment. So environments in this concept are an Azure DevOps concept that allows you to define different buckets, I guess, for deploying resources into, that they can include actual resources such as virtual machines and Kubernetes clusters and so on. It allows you to segregate development from production. Now, we're not using them to store any resources on the Azure DevOps side. All we're doing with the environment is looking to use them for a gate. So we want to, when we run this pipeline, we want it to automatically deploy to development, but we don't want it to deploy to production until we've validated it and manually approved that that release can move on to production. And so the way to do that at the moment with Azure DevOps is to use an environment. So if we go to the Environments tab, you see we've got this production environment. We're going to have a look here. There's this approvals and checks option. And so we can come in here and we can say we want approvers to approve the release, and we can add the approvers that we want to actually approve it. Now, the environment's not doing anything else. It's a bit of a waste, to be honest, but that's the way Azure DevOps set this up. All it's doing is providing that approval step. And that's what this extra bit of section here is using that environment. Unfortunately, it requires a bit more YAML to use than the dev one, which doesn't need that. Okay, so if we go ahead and run this pipeline, and you can see we get a visual representation of our two environments. So we've got our development environment here, and we've got our production environment. And so it started with the development. You can see it's got this dependency, so it can't do production until development's been done. And if we have a look in here, we can see the tasks that are being used. This is just waiting to run. It's just starting now. So that's run. We can see that that was successful. It was able to deploy the resources without any issue. Successfully deployed the template. If we go back to the main screen now, you can see the production environment is waiting. So it hasn't automatically run that because it's got this check where we need to approve. So we can come in here and it says, we must approve this. So we'll go in here and we'll click approve. And that's now going to run the production deployment and deploy our resources into the production environment. If we didn't like what we saw in development, we could obviously have rejected that and it would have stopped that from running. And so there you go, that's a release pipeline. So this is what you would use to actually create environments using your templates. And as I say, you can make these a lot more complicated. You can have lots of steps. You can do whatever you need to do to be able to get your environment deployed. So you could run your ARM template, deploy the resources, run some PowerShell scripts to do some additional configuration, maybe use some of the publishing tools to publish an application to a web app. You could do all of that. You could even add some notifications into that so you could have it call out to Teams or Slack or something to say that the deployment's finished. You can make these pipelines as complicated as you want. And the nice thing is that once you've done it once and you've got it all set up, then every time you run it, you should follow the same process. And it should make your life a lot easier when it comes to doing deployments and making them the same every time you do them. And there you go, you've seen examples of how to do both build and release pipelines using your ARM templates to allow you to release templates for use and to actually deploy resources using those templates in a controlled manner, using environments, deploying to development before production, and so on. As I said, you can make those pipelines as simple or as complicated as you want. You can add all sorts of steps that occur as part of your pipeline and fully automate all of your ARM template releases to be able to do consistent deployments, avoid issues, allow people to be able to trigger these sort of things who perhaps aren't experienced in using ARM templates and just want to get something released, and hopefully just make your life easier in general. If you're looking to get started, I'd very much recommend looking at getting a free account on Azure DevOps and taking the example repo we've got here, setting that up, getting it working, and that should give you a really good base to be able to start building your own pipelines to do whatever you want to do with your ARM template CI/CD. Next episode, we're going to have a look at something called template specs, which is a new feature of ARM templates, which allows you to store your ARM templates in a way they can be consumed, which doesn't involve a storage account or GitHub repo like we talked about in this video. So hopefully another new tool that will make life easier. Hopefully I'll see you then. Until then, have a great rest of your day.